Hello everybody, my name is Bobby Rollin. Today we're going to be talking about the fundamentals of flight instructing. Now, you're going to have to go over the fundamentals of flight instructing when you're working on becoming a flight instructor. I just had to finish these. I completed my CFI check ride about a month ago, and so these are fresh in my mind, so I figure I can walk you guys through it, help you pass your CFI check ride. So first, let's talk about human behavior. Human behavior is why people do what they do, and they usually do it to satisfy a need. Most human needs fall under a category known as Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So what are those needs? Those are physiological needs, so air, water, food, shelter, sleep, and sex, safety and security, love and belongingness, self-esteem, and self-actualization. They come in that order. It's super important to know what these needs are. It might sound really basic, but if a student comes to you as an instructor and their physiological needs aren't met, they're not getting enough water, they're hungry, or their safety and security is not going well, they're not going to be able to learn anything. How can you be expected to shoot an approach or do maneuvers, land on the 1,000-footers if you don't feel safe in your own home? The other stuff might feel a little bit more abstract, love and belongingness, self-esteem. You might be thinking, how is myself, an instructor, supposed to help a student with that? Well, it's important that the second the student steps into the flight school, you make them feel like they belong there. If the student feels like an outsider the whole time, they feel like they don't belong, everybody's better than them, they're never going to achieve their goals, they're not going to learn anything. Everything's just going to be a climb up a mountain. And by making them feel like they belong, we're reinforcing their self-esteem. Now, self-esteem might be a little more, something more out of your control, like if your student might be feeling depressed or anxious about flying. But it's on you to bring a positive attitude every single time when they go flying. And if you are able to help your student meet those needs, they'll be able to self-actualize by becoming the pilot that they want to become. What is motivation in relation to flight training? Motivation is why people do what they do. It's people who do things, they're motivated, usually to achieve a goal of some kind. In our case, our goal is to become better pilots. And so that's our motivation for showing up to flight training every day. What are some emotions that a learner might experience throughout the course of training? A learner will definitely feel the highs of, getting their first landing down, doing it all by themselves, their first solo. But there's also a lot of low emotions. It's super important that us as instructors are able to see these learner emotions and reactions and are able to identify them to make sure that they don't cause any accidents or cause the student to regress in any way. So the first learner emotion we want to talk about is anxiety. Every pilot experiences anxiety at some point. My first couple of flights, I was as nervous as can be. I hadn't flown in a tiny plane in forever. I was new to the system, so anxiety is very common, especially among new students. Another emotion is stress. Students want to achieve their goals. They want to be successful, and so they're going to get stressed out when they are introduced to a new topic that they have no idea about. And so it's super important that us instructors are able to help our students manage those stress, break down these stressful topics into achievable goals. Next is impatience. We've all been there, especially more experienced pilots can look back at a time where, I was a little impatient there. I could have used another lesson, or I should have studied more. It's super important that we set reasonable goals, and us as instructors are able to help motivate our students, but not overextend them or set unreasonable goals to where that they become, if we tell them we're going to get their private pilot's license done in 2 months and 2 months have passed and they still haven't figured out landings, that will create impatience. So that's why we have to achieve goals, set achievable goals so our students don't become impatient. Students might not become interested. If you have a student who tells you on the first day of class, I want to get done with my private pilot by the end of the summer, but they're only booking one lesson a week or one lesson every 2 weeks, and they're not doing any studying behind the scenes, and you can tell because their knowledge just isn't there yet, that's a student that's going to fall behind and eventually most likely fall out of the system. It's super important that as instructors we find positive ways to keep our students interested. Students might also experience worry. If a student is afraid, experiencing fear while flying, we need to address that as an instructor. It's super important that you build a rapport with your student, so your student feels like they can come to you when maybe they're scared of doing a maneuver, like for whatever reason. Let's say power off 180s scare them because they don't like having no engine power, or they're always landing high because they're scared of the ground. It's super important that we are able to identify these independently as instructors, but then also be able to communicate with our students and try to work through it in some way. A reaction students will have, one of them is fatigue. We've talked about fatigue in human factors before, so I suggest you watch that video as well too. It's super important that we are, as instructors, that we mitigate fatigue. So that means if it's going to be 90 degrees out, sun is blaring, we don't do that 2.5 hour lesson where we do steep turns the whole time. We keep it short, we try to mitigate fatigue, and then we also keep our students at a nice pace to where they want to keep coming back to us. They're getting enough in, they're putting in enough effort, but not getting tired from that effort. And that's both ground lessons and in the air. Dehydration, that's another human factor. We've talked about that before. Heat stroke can happen. You'd be surprised. It gets hot in those airplanes. Like I did most of my flight training here in Minnesota, and even in the winter time, you get your coat on, it's really tight. I did it in one Cessna 152. It gets tight in there, you start sweating. It can get hot in the planes, even in the winter time. So it's super important that hydration, heat stroke are all front of mind as an instructor. And apathy. This will happen when a student doesn't believe in you as an instructor. They think you're not a serious professional, or they don't think you know what you're talking about. If this happens, it's probably best if the student works with a different instructor. It's very hard to overcome apathy in a student. So let's talk about defense mechanisms. These are different emotional traits, I'd say emotional traits is probably the best way to say it, that a student will deploy in order to help protect their self-esteem when they mess up or do something wrong. We'll walk through these. So the acronym I was told to remember defense mechanisms is Dr. FCPR. So we'll walk through it. So first is denial, repression, displacement, rationalization, fantasy, compensation, projection, and reaction formation. Some of these you might have heard of before, but they definitely apply to aviation and teaching students. So first is denial, refuse to accept reality. Student craters a landing, tells you they did a great job. No, you did not. It's super important that you call out these defense mechanisms without putting them down in any way. Next is repression. So repression is when an uncomfortable thought are put into an unreachable part of mind. So let's say they really mess up a maneuver, or they almost put you in a spin when they go to do a power on stall. A student who is experiencing repression as a defense mechanism might bury that thought so deep that they forgot that it happened. We need to remind students that this is a possibility that can happen, and we need to learn from our mistakes. That's the key thing, learning from those uncomfortable thoughts. Displacement, when a person puts emotions onto something completely unrelated. It's easy to get that confused with projection, so make sure you keep those two separate. Rationalization is when a person subconsciously justifies unacceptable actions. So that could be like a student pilot cuts off somebody in the pattern when they weren't supposed to. And they're like, well, they were going too slow, or, they were doing something weird. It doesn't matter. It doesn't justify you cutting off somebody in the pattern or doing an unjustifiable action. Next is fantasy. This is one that me personally, I experienced a lot during my flight training. So you think about how things should be going instead of how things are. You'll see this a lot, especially in new students who feel like they're far away from achieving their goals. They'll be thinking about, they're thinking about their next pilot job, or they're thinking about their next airplane, or they're thinking about the airlines. I'm going to become a big airline pilot, when they still can't land on the 1,000-footers. This is a student that just needs to focus in and have these big tasks of getting your private pilot done, getting your instrument done, getting commercial done, broken into smaller, more achievable goals. Compensation, counterbalancing perceived weaknesses with perceived strength. We've seen that in real life where somebody might not feel manly enough, so they buy a big truck. Same thing can happen in aviation, but they say, like, let's say they crater a landing, and you get down on the ground, you park the plane, and you talk about it, and you as the instructor say, hey, you really messed up that landing. This is what you should have done differently. And the student says, yeah, but did you see my pattern? I was locked in on my airspeed, my altitude, everything looked great, my radio calls were great. That's somebody who's compensating for something bad happening. So it's important to acknowledge the good things that they do, for sure. We want to be positive, but then also make sure that they learn from their mistakes. Projection, putting your unacceptable impulses onto someone else. Last one is reaction formation. When a person fakes a belief opposite of the truth because the truth causes anxiety. All right, let's talk about effective communication. I've been told by instructors, and in my experience, communication is half the battle with your students. You're going to have a lot of students, a lot of delays, cancellation, upset students. You're dealing with a learner emotions. So it's super important that you understand the basic elements of communication. So that's our source, symbol, and receiver. So the source of the information, you're the source of that information. It's you, all the study material that you give them, that's the source. The symbol is how we communicate that. So that's by talking, by writing, by doing, and then our receiver, which is the student. You need to have those three elements in order to communicate with a student. What are some barriers to effective communication? Confusion between symbols. So if a student doesn't know what something is, that's going to be a barrier to you being able to communicate. If you're talking about a topic that they don't know, if you're talking about different kinds of V speeds, but they have no idea what V speeds are, the student's going to get confused, and it's going to be a barrier to you communicating something to that student. Overuse of abstractions. It's super important, and this is something that I struggled with. Teaching in vagueness. You want to be specific with your coaching and with your teaching when it comes to students. If you're saying a little to the right or a little to the left or just a little higher, a little down, especially in the aircraft, everybody has a different version of what a little, a small, whatever it may be. Be specific. So say, hey, you need to be down another 100 feet, or you need to slow down 10 knots. Be more specific. Try to avoid using abstractions. Interference. If there's something causing the student to not be able to communicate, be it a language difference. Lack of common experience. One of the things that's common here in Minnesota is people often compare the skills of flying a plane, or I'll keep it to myself. I like to compare the skills of flying a plane to the skills of driving a boat, specifically like talking about wake turbulence. If a student has never driven a boat or has never been on a boat before, they're not going to understand what you're talking about. And so that would be a form of lack of common experience. So that's why it's super important, going back to what we talked about earlier, that you build a rapport with your students so they can share, you can share in some experience, and that helps communicate information to them. How do we develop communication skills as instructor? This is another acronym. It's called LIQUIR, L-I-Q-I-R. Listening, instructional enhancement, questioning, instructional communication, and role play. So to develop communication skills, one, we got to listen. We got to be taking in information. Next is instructional enhancement. So that's always improving our teaching. Questioning, we're always asking questions to our students. So if we don't, let's say our student asks us something or is talking about something that we don't understand, ask a question, make it clear. Instructional communication and role play. Role play is a great way for you to put yourself in another shoe, or have your students put themselves in somebody else's shoe and really see things from a different perspective. It's super effective at all levels, the learning process. So what is learning? Learning is a change in behavior as a result of experience. So when you know learning has occurred when a student changes their behavior. So if you tell them, hey, you got to follow your checklist when you do your pre-flight, and you see them start using their checklist, you know learning has occurred because they changed their behavior. Behaviorism and cognitive theory are two big parts of how learning occurs. So behaviorism refers to sort of a carrot and a stick. So that's like action reward kind of thing. Think of Pavlov's dog. I know it's kind of arcane, but that's a form of behaviorism where we reinforce behavior with good things. That's a little bit arcane and not very applicable to a wider set of human learning. So another one that we use is cognitive theory. Cognitive theory argues that learning isn't just behavior, but also a change in how one thinks, understanding, or feels. So learning has occurred not just by their behavior, but also the way that they process information. That's something we really look for in pilots. Like, a student is ready to solo when they're able to perceive a problem and deal with it. You can see not just a change in behavior, but a change in the way they think. There's levels of thinking in the learning process. So first is knowledge, then comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. Let's talk about teaching adult learners. So teaching adult learners is going to be a lot different than teaching young learners. And I would put young learners, people under the age of 25. Adult learners are going to be autonomous and self-directed. Adults are very goal-oriented and want to solve problems and apply knowledge immediately. Adult learners also have usually a much more wealth of life to tap upon. So they usually tend to learn a little quicker and have a better understanding of the world that they're entering because they've experienced more life. It's important that when you're teaching adult learners to have a training syllabus, to integrate new ideas with what they already know. That's sort of tapping on their life experience that they have. Take advantage of self-directed activities and scenario-based training, but do not isolate the learner. So what do we mean by that? Adults are independent. They are self-driven. And so we want to give them activities that they can do on their own to make them achieve more, make them feel better because they're achieving on their own, but then that can also help accelerate the learning process. It's important that you do this alongside of the flight training. You don't want to isolate them. You don't want to send them away for 2 weeks or whatever, especially newer adult learners. But it's important to give them something to do outside of the school. Refrain from spoon feeding. Adults are they don't learn as quick as kids ages 15 and 16 do, but they are capable of learning, and they usually have a lot of knowledge even before they walk in the door. So it's super important that we don't spoon feed them answers and that we make them learn so that learning is ingrained into their mind. Create opportunities for mutual planning. So think about how you would interact with a student who's 18 years old versus a student who's 38 years old. A student who's 38 years old is going to be able to plan, have a lot more executive functioning skills than a student who's 18 years old. So we want to have the adult learner involved in their learning process. We don't want them to sort of be along for the ride. All right, next, let's talk about student perceptions and insight. Perceptions are learning that comes from our 5 senses. Instructors need to direct students' perception initially so they perceive relevant information. Perception factors include physical organisms, goals and values, self-concept, time and opportunity, and element of threat. Next, let's talk about insight. Insight is the grouping of perceptions into meaningful wholes. Creating insight is one of the main responsibilities of an instructor. So let's talk about these two. So perception is really basic learning. So it's learning with the 5 senses. So in real life, that could be learning, hey, that pot is hot, but how do you know that it's hot? You touch it and it burns your hand. You have learned. In aviation, our goal is to build perceptions as into wholes. So that could be perceptions of, all right, this tire doesn't look right. That's using your eyes. Let's touch it. That could be smell. That could be sight, obviously. We're reinforcing how things should be and teaching them the right thing to do. By building these perceptions, we build them into meaningful wholes. So I like to think of it breaking down a flight into parts. And think about each parts of the flight. You have your pre-flight, your taxiing, takeoff, cruise, approach, and landing. Those parts can all be broken down into 5 senses learning. How does it feel when you have a really strong crosswind? That's using one of your senses. How does it sound when the airport's very busy? And by teaching the right way through these senses, you're able to create insight. And the student learns, okay, this is the correct behavior. This is what we're supposed to be doing. And they're able to apply their knowledge that they've been learning on their own. Insight will occur whether instruction is provided or not. That's because humans are very smart and they're able to perceive how things are supposed to be done. It's our job to show them the right way. All right, let's talk about learning. There's a lot of learning that happens, and so let's break it down into a couple of key factors. How does a learner acquire knowledge? So first they get exposed to it, they memorize it, and then they understand it. So exposing them, obviously teaching them telling them these words, memorizing, and then understanding. So it's more than just knowing 1 plus 2 equals 3. It's, a student has acquired knowledge when they understand why 1 plus 2 equals 3. Next, let's talk about the laws of learning. This is a big topic. This will come up on your CFI check ride. Laws of learning, we use an acronym called REAPER. So that's readiness, effect, exercise, primacy, intensity, and recency. So let's talk about these. So readiness is the student has to come ready to learn. If the student's not ready to learn, they're not going to learn anything. Next is effect. Learning has to be positive. If learning's not positive, it's going to be really hard for that student to learn. Next is exercise. Humans do not learn something the first time they do it. The first time you went to T-ball, you did it once, you were not, Jackie Robinson. It takes exercise, it takes work to build up the learning. So that's why it's super important, and as instructors we follow syllabus, but then also follow up with our students. That's exercise. Next is primacy. This might be a new word for some people, but primacy basically means the first thing you learn is what's going to stick with you the most. So that's why it's super, super important that us as instructors, we do the correct thing the first time. Think about your first solo. Everybody remembers their first solo. Everybody remembers exactly how they felt after their first solo and during their first solo. That is an example of primacy. The first really sticks with you. Next is intensity. It's super important that us as instructors continually test and increase the level at which our students learn. It's important that we stress our students, but we don't overstress them to the point where they fall apart. We want to find that nice little stress threshold and make sure that we're always pushing our students to be better. And finally, recency. Recency is super important, especially early on in your training when you don't have a lot of experience to tap. Let's say you have a student who's super committed for 2 months and they're ready to solo, and just before they solo, they're like, oh, I'm going to school in, Kentucky or Canada or whatever. And they're gone for 6 months. And then they come back 6 months later and they're like, hey, I want to solo. And you're like, cool. You go up in the plane and it's horrible. They don't remember anything. Their landings suck. It's awful. That's an example of recency. A student who is recent, who is current, who is proficient, they will be able to learn and grow a lot more. So those are the laws of learning. What are our levels of learning? So that's another acronym. We have RUAC. So that's rote, understanding, application, and correlation. Rote memorization, that's just memorizing facts. You're learning sky is blue. That's rote. Understanding is why is the sky blue? And then application is you're able to use that knowledge of why the sky is blue and use it to help you in your flying. And then correlation is able to apply your knowledge to other subjects. That could be, I don't know, if you're a sea captain or something, if you're a boat driver, applying why the sky is blue to boat driving, that's an example of correlation. What are the domains of learning? So there are 3 domains of which a person can learn. There's cognitive, which is your mind, affect, which is how you feel, and psychomotor, which is doing things. A student will learn through all these emotions. They're going to think about flying a lot. They are going to feel scared, or they're going to feel happy or excited. That's affective learning. And then psychomotor, obviously we're teaching them how to do flying. What are key characteristics of learning? Learning needs to be purposeful. Learning is a result of experience. Learning is multifaceted, and learning is an active process. You as the instructor need to remind yourself of these characteristics of learning and make sure that they're reinforced during all phases of learning. All right, so we talked about knowledge. Let's talk about skill knowledge. So skill knowledge is different from declarative knowledge because a student is not usually aware of it. Think about driving a car versus doing a multiplication table. Doing a multiplication table is usually a result of memorization. Think about our levels of learning. But then learning how to drive a car, there's a lot of different stages of it. So let's talk about the stages of skill acquisition. So first is cognitive stage. So they have to think about it in their mind. That's sort of connected to our thinking domain. Next is associative stage. So they have to be able to apply what they're thinking. And the next is automatic response stage. That's the point where a student can do it without even thinking. So they can hop in a car, drive without even having to think about it. That's sort of the stage of skill acquisition, and that's what we should be looking for in our students when they're learning how to fly. Knowledge of results is when a learner knows if they're doing right or wrong. If a student can tell you right away exactly what they did wrong or what they did right and why that happened, they are very, very close to that automatic response stage, if not all the way there. How do you develop skills? Practice. So that goes back to think about landing practice and your own personal landing practice experience. You didn't get it the first time. You didn't get it the second time. By the third time, you might be able to say, I know exactly what I'm doing right. Know exactly what I'm doing wrong. But it's still not there yet. That goes to us developing those skills. Practice. There are a bunch of different types of practice. The three that we focus on are deliberate, blocked, and random. So deliberate is we're going to go up today and we're only going to do laps in the pattern. Blocked is, okay, we're going to go up today, we're going to do steep turns, we're going to do a rectangular course, we're going to do power off stalls, and then we're going to do landing practice. Random is where you go up without a plan and the instructor picks it on the spot what you're going to do that. The most common form of practice you will experience is deliberate and blocked. Random, I can't think of a time when I experienced random. I'm sure I have. But deliberate and blocked are really going to be the most common form of practice in your flight training. Another thing we want to talk about is a learning plateau. This will happen in skill knowledge. That is where you're learning, you're growing, you're getting a little better each time, but then for some reason you just hit a wall. You can't seem to get better. You just can't seem to nail those 1,000-footers. For some reason, it could be a maneuver. For some reason, your power off stalls, you just keep dipping your wing. Learning plateaus happen to everybody. It's super important that when a learning plateau happens, you move on from that topic and you return to it by slowly building that student back up. So think about a student who's struggling with their landings. They've made a lot of progress since when they started, but they just can't get it for some reason. And you can tell the student is experiencing a learning plateau. How do we fix that? Well, first, we acknowledge it. Happens to everybody. It's going to happen to you at some point in your training. And then we say, okay, let's go do something else. In the case, I struggled with my landings during my private pilot training. And what my instructor did was, let's go do a cross country. And so we did a cross country to St. Cloud, Minnesota. I really enjoyed doing the cross country. It's a lot of fun for me. But then also, another thing with St. Cloud is that they have a really big runway. It's like 150 feet wide, like 8,000 feet long. Super wide. And guess what? On that cross country, I nailed my landing. And that gave me confidence to go back to our local airport and get better and better and break that learning plateau. That's an example of myself, the student, experiencing a learning plateau and getting past it. Another thing, sticking on the landing topic here, if you see a student experiences a learning plateau, you could do the thing I talked about, which is just do something completely different and come back to it later. Or you can break it down into smaller spots. So before a student even practices landing, we're having them do rectangular course. We're having them do power off stalls. We're having them do slow flight. These are all things you can go back to break down the concept of landing the plane for a student. So that way they're able to say, okay, this is my power off stall. This is my slow flight. This is my rectangular course. This is how it's supposed to feel. And by reinforcing those skills, by practicing, you're able to help them get past that learning plateau. All right, next, let's talk about scenario-based training. This is a huge, huge, huge part of aviation learning. Why? Because aviation learning is not linear. Everything is scenario-based in aviation, from your flight plan to the weather. Everything's going to be scenario-based. So that's why integrating scenario-based training into your flight instructing isn't optional, it's mandatory. So scenario-based training is training the learner through meaningful repetition how to gather information and make timely and informed decisions. Really what that means is we're going to put the learner through situations, both real and made up, and teach them the right way to overcome this. We're going to do it both in the plane and on the ground, and outside when they go do their own self-study when they're studying. By doing this scenario-based training, we are training the student. We're using the law of primacy. We're teaching the first thing that they learn about these scenarios is the correct thing. But then also when they get into the plane and they experience a scenario like this in real life, let's say it's an engine out scenario, it's not the first time that it happens. We're reducing the panic, we're reducing the anxiety, the stress, and so they have something to lean on. The scenario-based training really helps improve a student's perception of flying, especially new students. It also helps learners become more confident. in-flight manager, that's what we're talking about. Understand the knowledge required for real-world scenarios, diagnose learning difficulties, and it helps us as instructors evaluate learner progress. Giving scenario-based training, again, is not optional. We do it at every phase of learning, and we do this to teach our students, but then also it helps us as instructors evaluate our students. All right, let's talk about errors. Everybody does them. It's part of being human. You will make a mistake when flying. I 100% guarantee it. It's super important that as instructors, we know what kinds of errors our students and ourselves will experience. The two types of errors are slips and mistakes. So a slip is an error of action, while a mistake is error of thought. So think of slip as like you meant to use right rudder on takeoff, but you accidentally put in left rudder. That would be an error of action. You know right rudder is correct, but you put in left rudder. That's a slip. A mistake would be you thought left rudder was correct, and you smashed that left rudder in on takeoff, causing uncoordinated flight. That would be an error of thought. Think of it like a mistake is a plan that you made or something that you thought incorrectly, versus a slip is just a mistake you made. Like a slip will happen if you mess up a radio call. You know how to make a radio call correctly. A mistake is where you make an incorrect radio call thinking that you're correct. How do we reduce error? We reduce error by learning and practicing, taking time, so slowing down, staying ahead of the plane. We check for errors, so that goes back to our checklist, but then also as instructors, our attention to detail has to be for ourselves and for the student as well too. We use reminders, develop routines, and raise awareness. I really like the develop routines. When you get into a plane, especially teaching students are copying your behavior. They're going to copy your routine of flying. And so it's super important that your routines try to compensate for human error. And we raise awareness when we do make a mistake. So if you're an instructor and you make a mistake, tell your student exactly what mistake you made. This will help them learn and not do that. Errors can be caused by distractions, interruptions, fixation, and inattention. The one I really want to focus on is fixation. Especially new students, new private and new instrument students, they're going to be overwhelmed. They're going to be on overload. They're going to be a sponge that's too full of water. And so they're going to fixate on one thing to try to make that thing perfect. And when that happens, other tasks are going to fall behind. They're going to miss checklists. Their altitude is going to be incorrect. Whatever it may be, we need to identify our students' fixation and help them move past that. Another one is inattention. Students might miss a radio call. They might miss an airport, whatever it may be. Those are ones that we want to be pointing out to our students to make sure they're developing good routines and habits. Next is evaluation versus critique. So evaluation and critique are two different things. Evaluation is I like to think of evaluation as when you're rating on a scale of 1 to 10, or when you're giving a grade to somebody. You're evaluating them based on a standard, versus critique is more like coaching. I actually don't like the word critique, because critique is inherently negative, and us as instructors are supposed to be positive. So I like to think of this as evaluation versus coaching. So coaching, as a learner practices a skill, is important that they perform the skill correctly. As an instructor, the skill is being practiced correctly by watching the performance and providing feedback. That feedback is our coaching. That's why we're there, to help them get better. And that feedback, we need to emphasize this, needs to be positive. We cannot constantly tell our students that they suck. Can't even say it once. Don't even say your students suck. They are learning. We are coaching them. Think about when you were first learning how to fly. You don't know anything. And if your instructor said the second time you did steep turns, wow, you really suck at this. We want our coaching to be positive, and we want us as instructors to be monitoring that. Versus evaluation, you're going to use that at key points in training to make sure that that student is up to a certain standard. All right, let's talk about this. What is teaching? Teaching is the act of instructing or training. It's our job as instructors. Some essential teaching skills are people skills, subject matter expertise, assessment skills, and management skills. So people skills, depending on who you are, might come super naturally to you, or it might be one of the hardest things in the world to do. People skills are super important to what we do as instructors. We're not only managing the plane, but we're managing our own schedule, our students' schedule, and our students' emotions. And those are people skills. Those are super important to develop as an instructor. Subject matter expertise. If you're already to the point where you're working on your certified flight instructor rating, you have subject matter expertise. But it's super important that we're always refining that expertise. We're always improving ourselves. Next is assessment skills. We got to be able to evaluate students, be able to endorse students correctly, but then also use good judgment. A lot of that comes with experience. So that's why when you start off early, you really want to stick to standards that are already established. And finally, management skills. Management skills is what you personally are going to be dealing with a lot when you first start instructing. From what I've seen, instructors tend to start off with a small amount of students, but then, after 2 or 3 months, they just explode with students. And so it's super important that you're able to manage not only the macro, think about all your students, but then also the micro. You're managing your time well. You're getting on the ground in time, so you have time to debrief with a student. So you gotta be a management wizard when you're a flight instructor. Next, let's talk about the teaching process. The teaching process organizes material in such a way a learner can understand it. So that teaching process usually comes in the form of a course of training. Course of training is a complete series of study leading to the attainment of a specific goal. So that could be a student's curriculum, syllabus, and lesson plan. The one that we use the most in flight training are their syllabus and lesson plan. So syllabus sort of lays out in the macro scale how we're going to achieve our specific goal, and then our lesson plan breaks down those blocks of learning into actions that we can take both as instructors and students. How do we prepare a lesson plan? So we want to have objective and standards. We want to have understand and train to the ACS standards. I like to say, too, we're training above ACS standards. We want to integrate decision-based objectives. So that means we want to see our students' behavior change. After determining objectives, the instructor must organize material. Traditional lesson plans are organized as an introduction, development, and conclusion. That's what we're doing as flight instructors when we're working towards our flight instructor rating. We're organizing the material. It's such a small part here of the slides, but it's a huge part of what we do behind the scenes as instructors. We're getting homework for our students. We're building pre-solo written tests. We're building slideshows. We're doing all this stuff. That's the organization of material. That's the heavy lifting you're doing behind the scenes. So there are different ways of delivering training to somebody. We obviously have the most common form, which is our lecture method. This is going to be used a lot during your flight training. So the lecture method is used a lot because it's super adaptable to many different settings and can be used to teach a variety of topics. You can use it to teach flying, you can use it to teach physics, you can use it to teach medicine, you can use it to teach anything. Like I said, widely applicable. 2 types of lecture, There's teaching and informal. Teaching lecture would be you have students in front of you and you have a slideshow or you have some kind of presentation and they sit for an hour and they take notes, and at the end of that hour it's over. An informal lecture would be probably similar to closer to ground school and a Part 61 school with your instructor. So that would be where the student is able to ask questions. You're sort of going from topic to topic. While still you as the instructor delivering a lecture, it's not as serious and formal as a regular teaching lecture. Think about the difference between a meeting with your instructor for a ground lesson versus going to a college lecture. It's going to be a lot different. That's the difference between teaching lecture and informal lectures. Disadvantages of lecture method are reduced learner participation and does not foster motor skill learning. Nobody's going to learn how to do a steep turn from a lecture, but they might memorize the steps and how to do a steep turn through a lecture. So there's pros and cons to each of them. Another one to talk about is cooperative and group learning method. It organizes learners into small groups who can work together to maximize understanding. Can be learner or instructor led. As instructors, if we're leading group learning, it's our job to facilitate. Conditions and controls. So we want our group learning to be small and heterogeneous. So we want to put, let's say, a group of 4 private pilots together or 3 private pilots together. We don't want to put a private pilot, an instrument, and a commercial student all in one group. That's not going to be helpful for any of their learning. We want to have clear, complete instructions. So let's say they're doing a scenario-based topic together. We want them to have clear objectives, clear instructions, and clear completion standards. And we want to give them, obviously, sufficient time for learning. If we cut them off halfway through, they're not going to learn anything. Some more training delivery methods. So we have a discussion method. So that's where an instructor picks a topic, brings students together, and you talk about that topic. Guided discussion, used to draw out knowledge through questioning. A common use would be a post-flight debrief. So that would be the instructor asking student, tell me what happened here, or tell me what you saw there. You're gonna use that a lot unintentionally, using the guided discussion method a lot. Demonstration performance method. This is the bread and butter for us teaching students how to fly the airplane. It's best used for the mastery of mental or physical skills that require practice, i.e. flying. This coincides with the drill and practice method. So after a student gets to a point where they're able to do their maneuver on their own, we're going to hit the drill and practice method. Instructional aids and training technologies. So instructional aids and training technologies, they supplement and support what is being taught. Instructional aids should be carefully selected, well organized, easy to understand, cover key points, and are relatively simple. Some types of instructional aids and training technologies, think about marker and a whiteboard, or printed material, enhanced training material, projected material, video, computer learning, interactive systems, and models and mock-ups. For me, I always carry a model airplane with me and a whiteboard. That really helps get concepts around to students. The advantages of using instructional aids and training technologies is it helps gain the attention of learner. We're trying to keep learning multifaceted, so by bringing things into the physical world, it will help students learn. It can help pass language barriers. So if somebody is English as second language, by being able to show things or to use a different instructional tool to help them learn, they might be able to learn a lot quicker. Next, let's talk about e-learning. So e-learning, I like to break this down into two different kinds of e-learning. So we have e-learning in the form of like King Schools and Sporties. Those have become very, very popular because they're super flexible in terms of your scheduling. You can do it anytime, anywhere. They're super affordable. Like I think Sporties is only like $330 for an entire ground course, and they're always up to date. We want to integrate e-learning into learning in the real world. We want to encourage our students to be using Sporties and King Schools, but then also reinforcing that learning that's occurring when they come into the flight school every day. Another form of e-learning is our flight simulators. So we have our basic aviation training devices, advanced aviation training devices, and our flight training devices. Looking at this picture of the simulator here, this would be a basic aviation training device. These are really good. I didn't use these a lot when I was learning how to private pilot. I really started to use these when I was doing instrument time, because in a BATD, I believe you can get up to 10 hours of simulated instrument at BATD, which is a cheaper way of building those instrument hours and learning how to do approaches, learning how to use like the GPS, for example, program holds, etc. It can be a really nice alternative than actually getting up in the plane. All right, let's talk about the big meat and potatoes, integrated flight instruction. Integrated flight instruction is what we will be doing 99% of the time when we fly up there. It's instruction in which learners are taught to perform maneuvers from both outside and instrument reference. To be fully effective, the use of instruments should be taught. So when we are teaching students how to do maneuvers, we are teaching them both, like let's use the example of steep turns. We're teaching them how to line up their nose with their horizon, what that bank feels like, but then also we're saying, look at your instruments. You're descending 500 feet per minute, or you're climbing whatever it may be. We're teaching the student to use all the tools at their disposal. That's really what the core of integrated flight instructing. We want them to be able to perceive and perform. Problem-based instructing. Problem-based instructing is when a student-focused type of learning versus instructor-focused learning. Problem-based learning starts with a carefully constructed question in which there's no single solution. This problem encourages higher order of thinking. So this goes back to our group method, our scenario-based training, case study method. You'll be using this a lot when you're on the ground. The time in which you could be using problem-based instructing or problem-based learning for a student is like when you're demonstrating emergencies for that student. So planning instructional activities. So we've talked a lot about blocks of learning. What is a block of learning? Block of learning breaks down learning into attainable blocks. So the student will learn how to do certain blocks, and then they put them together over time. Let's go back to our landing example. When a student learns how to do a slow flight for the first time, that's a block leading them to landing. And then we build on that block by adding power off stalls. They're learning how to flare. They're learning what that feels like. And then we're doing the rectangular course. They're learning how to fly the traffic pattern. And they're integrating all these different blocks and to meet the objective, which the objective is to learn how to land. That's an example of blocks of learning, but you can find that all throughout somebody's course of learning it in their aviation training. The nice thing about blocks of learning is that they boost learners' self-confidence. So think about back to that training plateau. When you hit a training plateau, your confidence is going to be low. And by breaking down these big goals into smaller blocks, students feel confident. They're learning things in bite size versus trying to take a drink from a fire hose. Next is training syllabus. So having a syllabus is super important. It is essentially a guide for instructors to make sure that training is accomplished in a logical sequence. It helps us as instructors not make mistakes and mess up a student's training. Syllabus do need to be flexible and used as a primary guide. So again, we're following the syllabus, but we need to be flexible with it. If the weather is bad, if the student is struggling with ground, we might not go flying that day. We might say, okay, we're going to deviate from the syllabus a little, stick with ground for now. If you're at a Part 141 or Part 121 operation, you're going to have a specific syllabus that you will need to follow. I did all my training in Part 61, so I'm not super familiar with what a 141 syllabus looks like. So leave a comment below if you've done Part 61 or Part 141, what's sort of the difference in those training syllabuses. Next is a lesson plan. So that's a breakdown, a smaller form of our training syllabus. So a lesson plan is an organized outline for an instructional period. Lesson plans should be referencing a training syllabus in how they are oriented. So for example, we're not doing our landing lesson plan first. We're going to start with, teaching them how to taxi and how to make radio calls before we do that. A lesson plan should be in writing and not mental. Our purpose in making lesson plans is that they provide unity in content, scope, practicality, flexibility, relation to course of training, and they provide instructional steps. Lesson plans are really more for you, the instructor. They are sort of a reminder of, hey, this is how this is supposed to go. This is the knowledge. This is the training that needs to be done in order to achieve the objective for that instructional period. As CFI students and as CFIs, you're going to be making a lot of these. Make sure they're uniform and that their scope is appropriate for the topic in which they're covering. This is an example from the Flight Instructor's Handbook that they give of a lesson plan. I don't love this one. I recommend integrating these lesson plans with an actual teaching lesson plan, because this one is pretty vague and doesn't meet a lot of things that a lesson plan needs to have. Let's talk about student evaluation, assessment, and testing. Assessment is an essential component of teaching and learning. It provides feedback to the instructor immediately on the quality of instruction. The student takes a test, they give you a result right away. There are two types of assessment, traditional and authentic. So traditional assessment is going to be like a yes or no question. It's going to be like a matching question, whatever it may be. That's more of a traditional assessment. An authentic assessment is closer to like a stage check or something like that. Characteristics of an effective assessment are they're going to be objective, flexible, acceptable, comprehensive, constructive, organized, thoughtful, and specific. So we sort of talked about authentic assessment, but it asks the learner to provide real-world tasks and demonstrate meaningful applications of skills. Learners must generate their own responses rather than using predetermined answers. So again, think about a stage check. A stage check is an example of an authentic assessment. Another way you can use an authentic assessment is through learner-centered assessment. So instructor uses open-end questions to guide the learner through a self-assessment. Another one would be maneuver procedure grading. All these things are meant to have the learner show what they know versus on a regular choice test, pick the right answer. So assessing risk management skills, there are different levels to it. So first level is explain. So the student can verbally identify and describe and understand in a given flight scenario certain risks, but they need to be prompted. So it's still instructor-led. Next is practice. So a student is able to identify, understand, and apply single pilot resource management to an actual flight situation while still taking coaching from us. So that would be a student that's probably close to solo, if not at the solo level already. And then the last one is manage to decide. The learner can effectively identify a course of action, evaluate risk, and make appropriate decisions. That's a student who's most likely ready for their check ride. Choosing an effective assessment model. So first, how do we choose this assessment model? We want to determine the level of learning objectives. If you have a student who's coming in and they just want to land the plane a couple times, that's their objective. But if you have a student who wants to complete their license, their standard of learning is going to be the ACS. We want to list indicators of desired behavior, establish criterion objectives, and develop a criterion reference test. So that criterion is most commonly the ACS. And we want to train and assess based on the standards of which that student should be at and wants to be at. So if the student only has 10 hours of flying, we're not going to assess them at ACS levels. We're going to assess them as a 10-hour pilot. But if the student is asking for a solo endorsement, we're going to assess them at a lot higher level. Assessment of pilot abilities. So there are the demonstrated ability and the post-flight evaluation. So let's start with the demonstrated abilities. Demonstrated ability must be based upon established standards of performance modified to learner's experience in order to be signed off for solo flight. The instructor needs to determine the learner is qualified and proficient in flight tasks necessary for flight. So that goes back to what level, what standard are we performing to? Again, 99% of the time that's going to be ACS, sometimes it's not. Post-flight evaluation. Traditionally, flight instructors explain errors in performance, possible origins, and corrective measures after each maneuver and lesson. So that's something we do after the assessment is complete. We really want the student focused on the task at hand during the assessment. So for those who have done check rides before, you will know that after the check ride is over, the examiner will often talk to you after in this post-flight evaluation, tell you what you did well, what you didn't, what you can work on, even if you've passed or failed. All right, so we talked about critique. Critique is an instructor to learner assessment. An effective critique should consider good and bad performance and should come immediately after a learner's performance. I like to think of critique as more like coaching, especially when it's coming from the instructor. If it's an instructor-based critique, it needs to be in the form of coaching. It needs to always be positive. If you give the student negative criticism, 9 times out of 10 it's going to hurt their self-esteem, and that erodes at their Maslow hierarchy of needs, making it harder for them to learn. Next is oral assessment. It's the most common form of assessment. It can be direct or indirect. It's usually a who, what, where, why, when question. So that's going to be questioning that you do throughout a flight. The characteristics of a good question is that it has to apply to the subject at hand. It has to be brief and concise, but also clear and definite, be adapted to the ability and experience of pilot, and centered around one idea, and obviously present a challenge. The key thing with these questioning is you want it to be specific, and you want it to have a correct answer. You don't want to do a trick question, an irrelevant question, nothing like that. We want our students to give us the correct answer. We're trying to help them learn. Practical test recommendations. So this is the fun part about being an instructor. A flight instructor who signs a student off for their certificate or rating should require the applicant to thoroughly demonstrate knowledge and skill level required for the rating. Instructors should train at to or above the ACS standards. When the instructor endorses the 8710, the application is valid for 60 days. Instructors need to document the completion of prerequisites for said practical tests. Those can be found in our AC 6165. I believe we're on Juliet now. If the flight instructor fails to ensure the applicant meets the requirements prior to endorsements or is endorsed for solo while not being proficient, the FAA may hold the instructor accountable. So if you solo a student who's not safe to solo, you could get in trouble for that. You want to make sure your students are at or above standards when you go to endorse them for something. Let's talk about the responsibilities as us, the aviation instructor. The job of the aviation instructor is to transfer knowledge. If you're training to become a CFI, you are a smart pilot. You have demonstrated that time and time again. Our responsibility is to help our learners, provide adequate instruction, train to establish standards, emphasize the positive, and minimize learner frustration. Those are at the core of what we do. Additionally, flight instructors have additional responsibilities, including evaluation of learner piloting ability, pilot supervision, practical test recommendations, flight instructor endorsements, additional training and endorsements, pilot proficiency, see and avoid responsibility, and learners pre-solo thought process, so that pre-solo written. So on the left here, the helping learners, emphasizing the positive, those are attributes we look for in good instructors. And then on the right here, these are things that are required. These are not optional of flight instructors. Flight instructor qualification and professionalism. Flight instructors need to be thoroughly familiar with all aircraft systems being used for training. Each flight instructor should maintain familiarity with current pilot training techniques and certification. If you are training an aircraft that you are unfamiliar with, that student is not going to be able to learn anything because you're learning at the same time. Do not train in an aircraft you are unfamiliar with or uncomfortable training in. One way that we improve our qualifications as flight instructors is through professional development. We should always be looking for ways to improve our abilities and qualifications to make us more effective instructors. You as an instructor should be thinking about the next rating or the next add-on you should get, whether that's a multi-engine or that's a high performance or high altitude endorsement. By you as the instructor becoming the student and becoming more knowledgeable, that will translate to better students. Your students will learn more because of it. Next is professionalism. Everybody knows why professionalism is important. Instructors are the central figure in all aviation training. As professionals, aviation instructors strive to maintain the highest level of knowledge, training, currency in the field of aviation. Professionalism is integral to how we carry ourselves as instructors. If you're not a professional, nobody's going to take you seriously. You have to dress appropriately, stay well groomed, stay well fed. You have to carry yourself to a higher standard. Next is ethics. Instructors must act in an ethical manner in their professional and personal life. This was a concept I had a hard time with when I first started instructing. I was like, what do you mean by ethics? Like, is there a code of ethics? Which there is for instructors, but it's not super important to what we're talking about today. How I got it explained to me, and I think it's a really good answer, is if you're a flight instructor and you're coming to work and you're speeding, swerving through lanes, not using your turn signals, flipping people off, that is not somebody you want to get into a plane with. But if you're an instructor who follows the rules, does everything the correct way, acts in an ethical manner, that instructor is going to be a better teacher. Risk management, again, paramount to what we do as an instructor. Risk management is formalized, logical weighing of potential costs versus benefit. Risk management should be introduced to their student from the very first lesson. 100%. We want to follow key principles of risk management, including accepting no unnecessary risk, make risk decisions at appropriate level, accept risk when benefits outweigh costs, and integrate risk management into planning at all levels. Risk management is a huge topic we talk about when flight instructing. And like it said from the textbook, we need to be taught from the very first lesson. It's kind of an odd thing to teach at first because it's something concrete for sure, but it's also how you evaluate that risk more than anything. And so it's super important. Think back to when we were talking about the laws of learning. Think back to primacy. Students remember the first thing. And so by demonstrating good risk management skills, by canceling a flight when it's 50-50, by showing them how you're evaluating the weather, how you're evaluating the plane, how you're evaluating the airport environment, the student is learning from that. And so we don't want to, there's always going to be risk when we fly. You're not going to get rid of the risk in flying. But what we are going to do is evaluate that risk and mitigate it to the best of our ability and make sure that it won't get in the way of our own safety. And by doing this and by communicating that to our students, we are not only keeping ourselves safe, but we're keeping our students safe too. All right, what is the risk management process? We're going to identify hazards, assess risk, and mitigate risk. That's sort of what we just talked about. Two main checklists that we use to mitigate risk is our PAVE checklist and our I'm Safe checklist. Again, go back to human factors if you want to take a look at that, specifically the I'm Safe. We'll talk about the PAVE here. PAVE checklist is pilot, aircraft, environment, and external pressures. So we want to assess the pilot, make sure that the pilot's good to fly. We want to make sure the aircraft is safe to fly, the airport environment is safe, and we don't have any external pressures making us want to do this flight. As an instructor, you have to be in charge. You cannot let a student push to make a decision that's uncomfortable, and you cannot let your students do things that are unsafe. That is your responsibility. Another way of assessing risk is a FRAT. Most flight schools have it. It's essentially a program that spits out the level of risk to a flight that day. I believe the FAA has one too. I'll leave a link to it down below. And obviously we have our 3P model. So the 3P of risk management is perceives, processes, and performs. So that's when a pilot is able to perceive the given set of circumstances for the flight, processes by evaluating the impact of those circumstances on flight safety, and performs by implementing the best course of action. Let's talk about ADM, Single Pilot Resource Management, and Crew Resource Management. Aeronautical decision making is a systematic approach to mitigating flight risk. There are two main forms of ADM. There are SRM and CRM. SRM is Single Pilot Resource Management. SRM is the art of managing all resources available to a pilot. So that's knowing your flight systems, knowing your aircraft, using your EFB. We want to see our student use the 5 Ps. So that's having a good plan, having a safe plane, managing their passengers well, managing their flight plan well, and managing themselves well, the pilot. Next is crew resource management. So you might be saying, we're not a crew, we're not co-pilot and pilot in command. That's not true. You are a crew. You are the student and the instructor. That is a crew. Crew resource management just refers to risk involving flights with multiple crew members. So that could be a flight attendant in the back. Even if you're a solo pilot, that's still crew resource management. We want to integrate our crew into our decision making. So that can be as simple as when you have passengers. You tell them, see something, say something. Or if you have a safety pilot, encouraging them to use all the tools at their disposal and be an active member of that flight. Risk management during flight instruction. So common flight instruction risks. Obviously, we have ourselves and our students, the pilot. We have our aircraft risks. The aircraft that we fly in during flight training is going to get used hard, and so it's super important that we stay on top of our aircraft. Environmental risks, so we're obviously managing the weather, but then even on good days, we're managing the environment. So if it's going to be 70 degrees, sunny, not a cloud in sight, guess what? There's going to be a lot of planes out there. So we need to manage that environmental risk by saying, yes, it's a great day to go flying. How can we reduce the risk of having all these planes out? Another one is external pressures. You're going to receive a lot of external pressures as a flight instructor. You need to trust yourself. You need to trust your gut. You need to train to these standards. When you do that, when you train to these standards, the external pressures that you feel will become less. Best practices for reducing risk: identify relevant hazards, avoid creating a hazard, so don't yourself identify other hazards, but then avoid becoming a hazard yourself. Discuss hazards during pre and post flight. Again, that's going back to integrating risk management to all phases of training. Prompt learner to identify hazards on their own. We're trying to develop independent pilots here, so we want them to be able to identify hazards. One thing that I like to do when instructing is to have the student identify the biggest hazard to that flight. So during the pre-flight, before we go out to the plane, after they make a go, no-go decision, I want them to identify the biggest hazard, and if that hazard presents acceptable risk or not. Managing risk during takeoff and landing. Again, as an instructor, especially a new instructor, you're going to be overwhelmed by everything. It's super important to remember to first aviate, navigate, communicate, and then instruct. The safety of the flight has to come first. So instructing is last when we think about aviate, navigate, communicate, instruct. We also want to keep our training within our own tolerance. So if we're not comfortable doing 2.5-hour training lessons, don't do it. Stick to an hour, stick to an hour and a half, stick to 45 minutes. Whatever you're comfortable with, you have to trust that. That goes back to our external pressures. And that's sort of a broad overview of the fundamentals of instructing. I organize this in the way that the ACS has it organized. I really recommend you go through the Flight Instructor's Handbook that the FAA puts out. They offer a lot more detail and a lot better examples. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please leave a comment down below. Other than that, have a great day.